Welcome to the John Perkins House on the campus of the Wilson Museum. Come with me as we explore this historic home. My name is Grace Tarr. I'm a tour guide at the John Perkins House. I've been giving tours here for about 5 years, and I fell in love with the house because of how it is portrayed in its original time period and how it was restored so that everything looks as exact as possible. The amount of attention to detail taken in this house is remarkable. John Perkins was a very wealthy sea captain, ship owner, and shipbuilder in the town. The Perkins house was first built in 1763 as a small framed Cape Cod. As John's business prospered and the family grew, the 4 front rooms were added to the Cape Cod, and later the Cape Cod was enlarged to become a 2-story L. These changes were done within a 20-year period from 1763 to 1783. The John Perkins house was in bad repair in the late 1960s, and several attempts had been made to repair it on the original site. When the Wilson Museum purchased the house, it was determined that the best solution was to dismantle the house and move it to the property of the Wilson Museum to be reassembled on a poured foundation. This project was carried out by Hoyt Hutchins with the assistance of his son Sherman Hutchins. It took 10 years to restore the house and another 10 years to fully furnish it with period pieces. Here is Sherman Hutchins speaking on restoring the house.
We started taking the building down in January of 1969, and it happened to be a particularly pleasant January and February. March, as I recall, was a little more nasty, but the first couple months of the year were quite nice weather, and we were able to tear a lot of the building down, and we left what is the dining room. That was the last room that we took apart so that we would always have some spot we could sneak into and get out of the weather on a particularly bad day. But as a general rule, it worked very nicely, taking the roofs off and the boarding off and the windows out, and everything had to be packaged up and put into bundles so that when it came time to put it back, we had the proper pieces in the proper places.
And this house was actually unusual because it wasn't a small shelter or a log cabin. It actually was a post and beam construction. It was much grander than the other homes at the time, even as just a small Cape Cod. Throughout the house, whenever woodwork had to be reproduced, it was made in the original manner, which meant using historic planes. 3 wood planes in the Wilson Museum were used to create the one piece of molding in the parlor chamber that was missing. A plane works by running a blade along a board multiple times until it takes the impression of the blade, therefore creating the beautiful patterns of woodwork that you see throughout the home.
The trim on the inside of the building, actually, almost none of it had to be replaced, but all of the other trim around all of the doors, all of the windows, was bundled up like I had said. And so when it came time to put any of that back, those bundles had to be brought back, put in the building in this 10-year process, and they had to all be stripped and cleaned of paint. And we took them down to the first layer so we knew what color it was. And a gentleman in Penobscot by the name of Edward Perkins was a master at mixing paint the old-fashioned way, and he did. We didn't use lead, but we did use other pigments to replace and match the old colors.
The paint throughout the house has been reproduced using dry pigments mixed with linseed oil and turpentine. It is noted throughout the house that every door was painted, at least on one side, with red ochre. This is an attractive color, but more importantly, the red ochre was local and therefore very accessible. Other material included yellow ochre, burnt umber, lamp black, and cobalt blue. While dismantling the Perkins house, Sherm and Hoyt Hutchins found split laths in the last addition, which were obviously repurposed, as their wallpaper had been applied to the wood earlier. It is thought that the wood had once been in the inside walls of the first Cape Cod house. Samples of this wallpaper were sent to Shoemaker and Company, and they agreed to reproduce the paper for the John Perkins house with the agreement that the wallpaper could be marketed in several colors and named Emily. The dining room is on display just as Phebe Perkins chose in the late 1700s. The presence of blue paint is a sign of wealth because blue was actually an extremely rare pigment. However, because John Perkins was a sea captain and also very wealthy, he would have not only had access to the blue paint, but he also was able to afford the pigment, making this a very wealthy room to welcome guests into.
The dining room has a little dish cabinet chamber that ends up having space between the living room fireplace and the dining room fireplace, and to save on brick, they made an archway in there That also acts as a place for storage. It has shelves in it, and anything stored in there would almost never have a chance to freeze. And so that, I'm sure, was used as a place for lots of storage that they really didn't want to have frozen, because even Castine gets very cold at times. The windows in the house are a very distinct pattern. People stop and look at them and study them and measure them, and they're made out of very heavy material. As you can see, the frames, the sides of the windows are approximately 4 to 5 inch square blocks. The bottom and top are approximately started with 6 by 6 inch square blocks. These windows are placed on the outside of the house, and then the sash goes in them. So the two sash, the top sash which isn't movable and the bottom sash which is, are both outside the boarding of the house. And so it makes the windowsills reasonably deep windowsills, which is a phenomenon that I'm not sure there's another house in town that has windows like that in it. Not one that I've seen, not with that heavy a framework. The great deal of the sashes were broken, and in the process of building new sash and trying to take the glass out of the old ones, a lot of that glass broke. Of course, it was extremely valuable at that time to have glass. I mean, that was something that his ships would have brought back from England.
All the sashes were replaced during the reconstruction. These were made using wood planes we have in the Wilson Museum collection. The planes of glass are hand-blown architectural glass made by Blanco Glass Company of West Virginia. And
they do a little bit too good a job. They want to be sure we know it looks old, and so they make it a little bit too wavy, because it's almost impossible to even see through it. And the old glass wasn't much better, but in many cases the old glass was better than the replacement.
Here in the entryway you can see water buckets. These are not original to the Perkins family. Fire buckets with the family name were typically hung by the front door for easy access should a fire occur at the home or at a neighbor's home. Once the fire was put out, the name would enable the users to return the buckets to their owner. The stair pattern that you see here was most likely painted so that the tread would not have to be repainted as often, and when it was repainted, it wouldn't have to be redone all the way to the wall, only the place that got the most traffic.
The chimney on the front side is probably 70,000 pounds of brick and mortar going up through the building, something like that, with 4 fireplaces. We did make the exception in each one of the fireplaces of hiding a cast iron damper in each one of them that can't be seen, so that they can be shut off. And of course they couldn't be when John and Phebe owned the place. They would have been open just like having a window open in your house. So heating the places must have been, without a fire going, must have been almost impossible. You'd have to shut rooms off naturally because of the draft that would, you know, pull a cat up through. You know, there'd be none of the other fireplaces were used for cooking. They would all just used for heat. And the fact that the chimney is inside the house and not on an outside wall. The outside wall chimney is a much later type of idea, more for looks than anything else, because they're not good for helping to heat the house. You take a fireplace like these where there's 4, and you run fire in them continuously, the bricks all warm up and just hold that heat for long periods of time. And so these fireplaces, where they go into the flues, we end up with 4 flues going through the roof. One is just over 40 inches square, and the other one is about 48 inches square.
The home also shows John Perkins' wealth. In the first 4 rooms, there are actually closets, which were fairly rare at the time. You had to have enough goods, either clothes or rugs or perhaps goods of other kinds, that needed to be stored. Most families did not have excess of anything. In some areas, closets were even taxed as extra rooms, which makes them even less likely to be present in a home.
As you can see here, this piece of plate that was replaced and repaired, but we saved the old pieces, and this is a good way of showing how the rafters and the plates were held together, where the pin would be driven in, the trenel. They're drilled about 1/8 of an inch off, so that as you drive the pin in, it pulls it tighter.
The smoke chamber in the attic above the kitchen has its original wooden slats for hanging the meat or fish above the kettle with smoldering apple bark or corn husks. This did not take the place of the summer smokehouse, but rather was used during the winter for smoking small amounts of meats.
The clapboards that we took off the outside, naturally we had to put those in bundles. We didn't try to put clapboards back in the same places because a great many of them weren't able to be salvaged. But what covers the front of the building are all old original clapboards that have been taken off and cleaned, and we even put a layer of fiberglass on the back side of the clapboards before they were put back on. And the rest of the building, a lot that were hand planed, mostly by my dad, so that they still look like they were old ones. And the ends of the clapboards are tapered. They're called feathered. And that's because clapboard that just butted together today has something behind it for a building paper that any leak would be taken away by. Well, there was no such thing in 1783. So the clapboards had to overlap each other. So some clapboards might have a square end, but that's because it's butted against a window or a door. And then if it's got a feathered end, that's because it feathered into another clapboard.
The main focus of the kitchen is the huge, deep fireplace with a bake oven built into its left side. The bake oven has its own flue, which joins with the fireplace flue just above the area of the mantel. The sideboard in the kitchen is thought to be the oldest part of the house because of the type of hand-forged nails used in its construction. This room is similar to the first Cape Cod built in 1763, where the family cooked, ate, prepared for the next day's work, and slept. Even when the two additions were made, one can imagine this room continuing to be the hub of family activity.
But so much of this kitchen was so totally worn out that some of the, like for instance the floorboards, are replaced from several other old buildings, and a lot of care and time was taken to fit them together in such a way that they looked like they were worn together. So we would put boards down, that doesn't just look right, so we'd move them around in a different way until they finally looked like they had worn that way. And so now the floor, even though it isn't original, certainly looks it.
The room off the kitchen is a multi-purpose room used for berthing, sick room, or storage.
The building itself, this time when it was put back, was put on a poured concrete foundation with a layer of split stone around the top so that anything you see from outside is still split stone, which makes it look quite original. And the reason, of course, that we chose to do that is not only for the stability and longevity, but also for the use of the basement, which we now use for tool and farm implement storage.
The John Perkins House was placed on the National Register of Historic Places on December 30th, 1969, because of its historic significance, being built prior to the Revolution by a man who had a significant impact on the community.
When it came time to take the fireplaces down, that was kind of last. This fireplace here was rebuilt by my dad, but when we took the bricks down, any of the bricks that show on the face of the fireplace, we boxed up and numbered, so that when we put the chimneys back in, we put the same bricks in the same order that show on the face of the fireplaces. Even though some of them are broken badly, and it's because somebody was splitting kindling on the hearth to start fires, I'm sure, and all the beating and pounding over a couple hundred years broke them up pretty badly. Once we got the clapboards off, took the boarding off, because it's all boarding that was up and down sawed, probably from a mill in Bucksport that sawed lumber only, up and down sawed. Anything for the timber in the building was still at that time being hand hewed. And so to take it apart, when we got all of the boarding off and there were just timber left, the pins that hold the corners together would have to be driven out, and we saved them. And then we were able to lift the place apart because nothing was nailed together. And they were already marked. The people that built the place, Mr. Perkins or whoever helped him, would frame up a whole section, and they would number each piece with a jackknife that had a little crook in the end of it. So if they wanted to mark something, the other piece that it mated to would be numbered the same. The process of putting it back started the next year, and one of the things we had to do, of course, was Any timber that did have a bad end on it, we'd have to cut it off and re-splice it out and make it just like it was before with some other pieces of old timber, or even hand hewing something new to splice into it. And then that process went on during the summer, and the building was framed with the same pieces. We would put trennels back in and hold it in place with the braces. And then when the boards went back on to hold them in place, we could put a nail through any nail hole in the board, and it would fit in the same hole that it originally was in, and that would hold it on. And of course, nails weren't much of a problem. They were a huge problem when the place was built, which is why they used so few. And so we were able to nail it much stronger than perhaps it was, but it's still with the hardwood wooden pins that drive in, and as you drive them in, they sing. They make every hit makes a little bit higher pitch until it's all the way in, and it tink, 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 and makes a great noise. The process of putting the building back in shape and boarding it all back in was a relatively quick procedure to make it watertight. We did that the first summer, but the process of putting all of the trim on and then getting all of the trim on the inside was a 10-year project from start to finish. And then after that, the next project, which was another 10 years, was furnishing it, because every piece of furniture in it is period, with the exception of in the kitchen, where some of the pieces are things that were made to look like they originally would have looked, and my dad built those. Fortunately, this house had never been modernized. By the time the museum bought it, it had never had a bathroom in it. It had never been wired for electricity, short of a few lead cords. A good friend of my dad's, he was born in 1919, was born in this dining room in here, and he told me about it. That's one of the last people that I know of, anyway, that was actually born in the house, and his name was Ralph Gross. During the deconstruction of the home, as we tore it apart, my Dad and I spoke several times about how we should try to save a section of the old plaster so that we would have it for display so people could see what horsehair plaster looked like. And what we replaced all of the plaster with is a much more modern plaster, but we finished it on the last coat with wooden shingles, and the lime coat has a little bit of sand mixed in with it to make it a little rough so that it looks the same. But back to the piece that we wanted to save, in the last room that we were tearing apart, I was working on the ceiling one day trying to get some of it down without getting too much broken up, and all of a sudden a big section fell down from the ceiling and landed on the floor, ceiling side up. As it went down, it flipped over, and that piece is now on display in the back hall here in the Perkins house.
On behalf of the Wilson Museum, we hope you've enjoyed this intimate tour of the John Perkins House along the coast in Castine, Maine.